Hey everybody, welcome to the second episode of Tim and Tim Talk Tech. My name is Tim Myers. Joining me today is Tim Hudson. Morning, Tim.
Hey, good morning, Tim.
So we should talk about our first episode. Crazy idea. Um, put some time together, recorded some of our thoughts, put it out there to kind of generate some feedback. Man, we got 1,700 views of episode one. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time to kind of watch this. We're really, really excited that you found some of this content useful. I mean, that's pretty amazing. I think for today's episode, we're going to continue on in the Office 365, series, right? Talking about our new Veeam Backup for Office 365 4C. One of the things that we want to do today is really kind of cover what's new in 4C, talk about some of the changes that you may notice from if you're running a previous version to the new version that was released, some of the caveats that we've noticed. I mean, Tim, you and I have talked quite a bit about some of the little hips and hurdles along the way that are be good to point out to the audience to make sure that they don't trip and stumble along the way. And then next week, we're actually going to go one step further and look at what does tenant self-service restore look like and more of the Office 365 integration from a Cloud Connect perspective. So Tim, I think maybe what we do today is we just kind of start fundamentally with what's new in 4C. Why don't you take us through and show us what you've seen, what you've learned, and we'll do a little screen sharing today and see what kind of trouble we get into. How's that?
Yeah, I think that sounds great, Tim. One thing that I want to make sure we present to the audience is a bit of big picture advice that we think everyone can take away, but also those little things, the tips and tricks. We want to try to have a nice balance of both. So let me share my screen and let's look at the release notes for 4C. I think what we want to make sure the audience is aware of, and Veeam's tried to make it clear in these release notes, that we did have an issue with this particular build. It came out as 4.0.1.519. That was the 4C build number. And we had a particular issue with backup jobs creating full backups when they should be doing incrementals. And we recalled that release. We've since provided a new release, and what you'll see is that if you install the currently updated version, you'll be at 4.0.1.531 in this case, and there's a particular special KB if you happen to be one of the really few number of folks who downloaded this the moment it dropped on the public internet originally. So two options here in terms of getting to 4C, and in terms of the new stuff, Tim, there's two main bullet points here, and we hinted at what these things would be last week during our conversation. We talked about how the industry moves quick, and in previous versions of Office 365, we had particular methods that we leveraged to back up particular data types, right? Whether it be Exchange or OneDrive or SharePoint. And what we can see here is that the front and center, the first thing 4C provides is this modern app-only authentication. So it's not just modern auth, it's modern app-only auth without those legacy protocols. It's a new mode of auth, and we're going to show it here in the screen share in a minute.
Yeah, I mean, this is really good stuff, right? I mean, just from personal experience, and anyone that's currently stepped through the Veeam Backup for Office 365 integration with their existing O365 org, the number of steps that you had to take to just bridge into the modern authentication, right? All of the administration on the Office 365 side, it was very tedious. Number of steps. A lot of times the backup administrators are not necessarily Office 365 administrators, right? So we got a lot of feedback as an organization around some of the hurdles that they ran into, right? People sharing some of their frustrations and just candid feedback to Veeam. So I think we're really excited to show this to you today as we get into the app-only authentication and the number of things that automatically happen in the background now to really kind of remove that frustration that's been occurring. So good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and carrying on, it's not only when we're adding our organization that we can take advantage of this new method. The application will continue to use this new method throughout its life performing backups. But we can also leverage this new method for creating these auxiliary backup application accounts, which we'll show in the screen share. But this is, just another piece in terms of making the puzzle more simple. And another thing we'll show during our screen share is this first bullet point for the enhancements section, where we just want to point out that alongside the Office 365 application are our Veeam Explorers. And these Explorers get updated with backup and replication or with backup for Office 365. And now what we've done is we've put in a mechanism to auto update these pieces going forward, as well as these patches for VBO. So this is something that I think all of our service providers and the end customers will appreciate, the built-in update mechanism. For those who are running Service Provider Console, they'll notice that Service Provider Console, maybe they'll recall that Service Provider Console brought in an auto update mechanism with version 4 as well. So you see the story from the Veeam side, being built. All right,
Yeah, I mean, just as a side note there, if you're not currently today leveraging the auxiliary backup account capability inside of Veeam Backup for Office 365, you definitely should. It certainly helps to alleviate the Microsoft throttling that we've all kind of known to love and appreciate at this point. And again, back to the simplicity now to be able to not only create those additional accounts, but get them integrated and ready for consumption really minimizes the amount of administration time that it takes to get those created, right? So you definitely want to hone in on that as well. So great, buddy. We're in the lab, the famous Tim Hudson lab here. So what's the first thing you want to show us?
Well, I just want to point out the package that you'll get if you hit the release notes like we showed, and you go to download at the bottom of the release notes page. What do you get? You'll get a zip file, and inside that compressed package here, you'll find the Office 365 install. I think I mentioned that our versions have changed. I wanted to point this out in terms of the package. What you'll notice is our application for O365 is at 531. Our Explorers are at 519. We're going to see this again during our conversation today, but it's just important to recognize in the moment in time, this is our latest greatest of these two versions, and they matter a lot in terms of compatibility. So having that education to know there was this particular hiccup and this thing changed, but our Explorers didn't have an issue. So they retain their version number. It's just good to know. It's nice to see this in reality. Welcome to the world of software, right? So if this is our package, what does it look like when I've installed it? The normal GUI we're familiar with. You'll notice immediately if you hit the hamburger icon, this upgrade button here. This is part of our net new capability here. We're just going to check here for updates, and I'm all set. Right. So nice new feature here. And had I needed an Explorer upgrade, it would take care of it here for me.
So just to confirm, right, this not only checks the core Veeam Backup for Office 365 product, but will also check for available updates for each of the Explorers as well.
Correct. Yep.
Great.
We mentioned as part of the main feature in 4C is this new method to add our organizations. What you see on screen is this multi-tenant VBO install in the lab. And I want to show you a process, or the process, to add a new organization. But before that, I'll mention or describe the layout of the lab infrastructure. I leverage object storage. And I do this, Tim, because it provides those things that our service providers generally require, and items that they describe to their customers as the value added benefit for working with them. So what are these for object storage? Significant data reduction, up to 50%, compared to a Jet database living on block or file, which was the required backup storage before version 4, was something like less than 10%. So leveraging object storage, get a much greater data reduction rate. I'm able to leverage encryption, something we couldn't do with the standard Jet database. Service providers generally require their data to be secured, and this is the method that's available in this particular product. And there's a couple other, just general reduction of the number of Jet databases is the last one I'll mention. But here you can see that I've built a bucket per organization that I'm backing up.
That's an interesting concept.
Yeah, it's a similar concept from my repository screen selection here as well. So let's look at the wizard for one of these, for example. Each organization that I backed up here, I put into a separate repository. And for me, you can see the repository path is all on the same proxy and all in the same drive letter, but it's in a separate folder per organization. So I've named this repository my org name. I'm going to put it on that proxy, and I've already browsed and built this folder, which can be done here when you're creating a new repo. And I'm picking here, I've already selected to offload to this particular bucket and encrypt this data. One common thing I see in the field working with my partners is they don't realize that you've got to do the object storage setup first. You only get one chance, here in your repo wizard. You can't change this. So today, I pre-built that bucket, like I said, and then I build the regular repository here and choose to offload and encrypt. So this gives me kind of that full capability of the benefits for leveraging object storage.
But Tim, that aligns, as we've been architects for a number of years, right? This aligns with what I think are fundamental architectural principles of identifying what the roles and responsibilities are of the different infrastructure components that get created, right? So two pieces. Step one, what I heard is pre-create your buckets, your S3 buckets, before creating the repository locally on the VBO server, right? The more important thing that I've heard, and I want to just kind of tease this out a little bit, is consistency and naming convention to help align resources that are being leveraged per tenant. So the S3 bucket could be the tenant name, the repository, one repository per tenant can be the tenant name, and then obviously you've got the tenant name as you add them into the organization. So if I'm an administrator and I'm trying to troubleshoot a scenario, it seems like it makes pretty simple sense to me that I know exactly where those resources are located. I know exactly where the data is located. I know exactly where the S3 bucket responsibility lies for the data that's being offloaded to the object repository. So just out of curiosity, are we seeing just a little bit of, maybe a preview of some of the type of guidance that's going to be in the VBO RA that we talked about last week?
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. This is the lab we're using to understand expected behavior at large scale as a field engineer. And yes, this is the method we'll be proposing in that reference architecture for the reasons you described. It's really important to keep our tenants' data separate. This is a great way to do it. It's a simple descriptive method. Perhaps instead of organization name, maybe you as the provider have a 3-letter acronym for every client, or somehow you have a unique identifier for each of those clients. They all provide that same benefit in my mind. And not just from an organization standpoint. Think of showback or chargeback, or some operational information like how many objects are in a particular bucket. So if I know I've separated everything per tenant, organization, or end customer, then you can always hit that top level bucket and understand this is the total amount of space used without asking VBO. Right? Of course we can ask VBO and get answers to questions like this, but we can also just simply look at the object storage implementation as well. And it's nice that there's so many options because we know our providers want data from multiple sources. And so it's just really beneficial to be able to break this down in a simple, organized method so that those administrators and other resources at your provider can understand this information.
Yeah, that's great. So Tim, one of the things that I really would like to make sure that we show the viewers today is that new process that we talked about, right? Going back to the beginning and the what's new and the ease now in which you can add an organization, you can do the app auth only. So maybe you could kind of step us through some of the differences. What does it look like today in the new version? And I see that you've got a number of O365 organizations there. Do you have any that are perhaps doing basic authentication as well? And maybe just point out some of the differences along the way. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, sure, Tim. So we're looking at an organization. I built all these through demos.microsoft.com. Shout out to Tim Smith for hooking me up and letting me know that this existed out there. For any of our viewers, if you go to demos.microsoft.com, sign in with your organization information, you should be able to build demo tenants for a purpose like this. And I find this very beneficial. Didn't cost myself or Veeam anything, as far as I know. And it allows me to run through a set of testing like this to look at, in this case, how does 4C behave with basic authentication? I'm editing an existing org, so it looks slightly different than adding a net new org, but I'll click next here and you'll see when we leverage basic authentication, what we provide to the system is an administrative username and password for my O365 org. Simple, it's easy, but I've provided the keys to the kingdom via this admin username and password to this application. Works just fine, but this is part of that feedback we've got from the end customer and provider community to get to a better place from an authentication perspective. And so I'd like to show you that now. In 4C, when I go to add an organization, I will be prompted, what method do I want to leverage to add this organization? I could pick basic like we just looked at. I could pick modern auth with the checkbox for legacy auth protocols. And what this is kind of a hybrid between where we're at today with latest, greatest 4C and basic auth. It just doesn't meet the needs of our most demanding customers and partners. So we iterated, we got to this 4C perspective, and when I click next here, again, I'm not selecting basic auth, and I have not selected a checkbox to use these legacy auth protocols. The next screen prompts, do I want to use an existing AD application or register a new one? I'm going to register a new one, and immediately the terminology has changed. I was previously providing a credential set. Now I'm providing an Azure AD application. In the end, VBO is going to do a similar amount of work, a similar method. But for you as the user, it's much easier to build this here. I'm going to build a new Azure AD application. I named it VBO. As far as I know, this the name does not matter. And I'm going to create and provide a certificate here to authenticate for this application between VBO and the app out in Azure AD. I'm going to generate a self-signed cert. And I'm going to check this box because I want to provide the most SharePoint capability here. And the details, I think, are easily understood here. And when I click next, we get this new screen. And Tim, this is something we'll touch on again, I believe, today. And I think we'll touch on it in our next chat as well.
Yep.
What does this mean? And so what we're doing here, in order for us to be able to create this new Azure AD app, I'm going to have to authenticate. So I'm going to navigate to Microsoft.com/device login. So let me change my screen share here. You'll see I'm in incognito mode because I've been doing this quite a bit. Okay, and so I go to device login, and what I'm prompted, if you recall in my previous screen share, there's a code. We have the quick copy code button. I've done that. I've provided my code, and I get an authentication prompt. If I provide my credential set here, my admin credential set, we are not saving this in the VBO app anymore. We will create our Azure AD application. We will provide it the permissions, and then we will subsequently leverage that app for all future work. So we haven't stored that administrator credential set, which is a massive improvement and really a big difference maker in my opinion. I'll switch my screen share back now. So had I authenticated at that previous screen, I would have been informed here that we've authenticated correctly, because we're tying that code to the authentication. And we would have built the Azure AD application and provided the appropriate credentials.
So at the conclusion of that, then what do I see, right? So assuming that you had followed through and stepped through that complete process, what would be the expected view here now in the interface?
So we would see an organization here in the interface with no jobs, right? Because all we've done at that point is add our organization. But we mentioned an improvement in the way we handle our auxiliary accounts. And as a reminder, something you mentioned earlier in our chat, with Microsoft Exchange, with Office 365 Exchange, we impersonate users and we query the Graph API as that particular user in Exchange. So there's not really a lot of throttling there. So we're like changing our context with each user. But with OneDrive and SharePoint, we don't have that same mechanism. And so we can be throttled. And we want to leverage additional accounts in order to bounce back and forth and prevent this throttling from taking place for any real length of time. Here in our screen share, I've got this basic auth account. And you'll notice that what I've highlighted here is manage backup accounts. And that manage backup applications is grayed out. Because this was a basic auth org, this is how folks would see it today if they tried to add these additional accounts. This works swimmingly well. It's really not that hard, but it's different in 4C. And so here with my basic auth, I'm able to select the security group, which we assume was pre-populated with a list of users that we're going to leverage to back up OneDrive and SharePoint. I would be asked to provide the passwords for all of these particular individual accounts. And these are real usernames, real passwords, real accounts. That's legacy now. Okay, it's legacy now because in 4C, I'm able to select manage backup applications. Oh, that's pre-configured. Let's find one that's not been pre-configured. Here we go. Get a better example here. See, it looks different. I'm not selecting a security group here. Instead, we're going to add new applications. Security groups are tied to those user accounts. And now with modern auth, with no legacy protocols, we're leveraging those AD applications. So I'm going to create a new set of applications. I'll call this VBO apps. Again, we've got the same certificate balance here between, like this is the thing we'll be leveraging to auth with Azure. I'll create a new self-signed certificate just like I did before. And the Veeam standard number in the field that I hear, especially when dealing with support and trying to work around these throttling, the default number of additional application or backup accounts to create is 8. So I've picked 8 here. And I'm going to hit next. And what do we see?
It looks a little familiar. We saw that earlier.
It looks familiar, right? So we'll walk through the same process. I'll open up my incognito window from a lab perspective and dump my code in there, and I'll provide my credentials, and we'll create these additional accounts. And to answer your question you're thinking of, Tim, what does it look like? It looks like this.
So Tim, let me make sure I understand this, right? There's no longer a need as the backup administrator to have the fundamental understanding of logging into Azure AD and manually creating these apps and their passwords and assigning them to the Office 365 infrastructure. All those manual steps are now gone away in 4C. We instrument all of this for the backup administrator and the Office 365 administrator automatically through the process that you've just seen. No longer have to type in those usernames and passwords. We simply have to go to that device login URL, copy a code, let it do its wizardry, and this is what we end up with.
Absolutely. It's a really impressive improvement. I think from the field, in the interest of transparency for our listeners out there, there's a couple of caveats. It's different. It's new. All of those things are listed in the release notes. So if you want to know the nitty-gritty little caveats, it's listed in the release notes. For example, what's something that's really minor, but it is different? The measure full backup size commandlet doesn't function with an organization set up like this. In my opinion, this is really minor. There's so many ways to get that data through a different method. Well, maybe it makes a difference to you, maybe not. I think it's minor. All these things are listed in those release notes. So last week we talked about education. We talked about the value of looking at the documentation that we provide and the leverage the education for your VCSP engineering team. I mean, it's these things that I think make the difference. But it's there if you want to read it. So looking forward to a nice holiday weekend myself. I'm sure I'll be curled up on some patio furniture with a beverage of choice, reading some documentation because it's out there and it's easy to get.
So Tim, speaking of documentation, just one thing I want to leave with. I know we're kind of getting short on time, but one of the other projects that the team has been working on is really kind of an update to our Veeam best practices. For those that may or may not know, there's an independent website that's really kind of managed by a number of Veeam employees that speaks very specifically to Veeam best practices. And one of the, not only are we doing kind of a design update, obviously there's updated recommendations based on new product releases. Why don't you spend, maybe just a minute or two and kind of, highlight some of the information that a viewer may be able to find specific to our VBO product?
Yeah, sure, Tim. So one thing that we'll take care of for the audience is we'll put in some of these links and guidance into probably your post for these sessions. So these links will be there, but this is vbo.veambp.com. And if I had one thing to point out here of particular value, we leveraged object storage in the lab. We said this is what we're going to propose for a reference architecture. There's information about object storage that I think is of great value to our user base. We mentioned in the screen share the need for that local repository. In my case, it was on my E drive, and I made a separate folder for each of our tenants. What's stored there? What kind of space requirements do you have? Here it is, detailed on screen for the audience, right? This is the type of information that I was referring to last week during our discussion when we said there are things that are built for the every user. It might not be specific to a service provider, but here it is, that is for the every user, and it's completely relevant. So for example, to answer my question, what kind of storage do I need to account for on that local repo? Rule of thumb, about 1% of the source data size would be stored in that local repository. And it's clearly described here that we leverage this for this kind of view data or cache data on disk so that we don't have to talk to object. It's a nice way to tie what we've been talking about to great documentation made by Veeamers across the globe. There's some really incredible amount of collaboration going on to develop this site, and it's a great resource. So a nice way to tie back what we've been talking about to something that exists for the every consumer.
Yeah, and I think this in particular is really important because for those that may not be using the object repository capabilities in VBO yet, there may be this outlying question of sizing of the local repository. And when you go in and you actually create that object repository, object storage backed repository, it tells you that you have to create a local folder. And then you tie that local folder to the actual object repository bucket. And so, just kind of naturally thinking about this, if I've got a 1 terabyte object storage repository, maybe somebody's asking, do I need to also have a 1 terabyte local storage capability? So being able to come and look at this site and seeing, well, no, I don't actually. That local folder is really just for the cache, and the sizing recommendation there would be 1% of whatever the bucket availability is going to be in the object storage. So this helps answer those outlying questions that maybe an architect is trying to figure out on their own, from a service provider perspective, and may not be reaching out to their local VCSP sales engineers. So this is great. Tim, I think we're just about out of time. I want to take just a quick second and try to summarize a little bit of what we've talked about. I've heard what's new in 4C, right? We've definitely taken a lot of the headache away from the administrator's perspective of having to go in and manually create all those administrative applications and passwords and all those things that they were traditionally doing in the pre-4C instances of VBO. I've also heard that based on the current state of the deployment, they've really got 3 different choices. They can have the basic authentication, they can have the modern authentication, but they still got the legacy protocols enabled, and they can really move to kind of the latest and greatest, if you will, which is the modern app-only authentication. So it's great to see that the product can be instituted and configured to support any and all of those different scenarios, right, depending on the customer's current configuration. We've talked a little bit about some of the things that we can look forward to see in the reference architecture that's being built, right? The idea of simple and consistent naming across the tenant name, the repositories, as well as the object storage buckets, which makes it just real simple from a management perspective. We've looked at where a user can go and look at current documentation that really kind of backs up and supports a lot of the things that we'll be talking about both today and in future episodes. Is there anything that I missed?
No, not in terms of what we talked about. Just the hopefully you've seen some of what we mentioned last week and throughout this week, that the product is straightforward. It's come a long ways since the early days, just in terms of usability. And this is why we're seeing the type of growth and just significant use that we are.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, guys, I think that's a wrap for episode 2. Tune in next week as we're really going to now move over to the self-service tenant restore piece of our Office 365 conversation. And, again, thanks so much for your time. Again, any feedback, recommendations on topics or conversations or any additional information that you'd like to hear from us, please feel free to share that information. And, Tim, with that, thanks so much for your time. And guys, take care.